Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everybody. There was a handout. Did everybody get a copy of the handout? Yeah, the handout is actually very similar to a table that's already in the book on page 307. It just has a few additional items. But still, it's useful to have the handout because of those additional items. Okay, so in the last class, we studied the Samadhi Sutta, and the main part of this sutta is concerned with an exposition or an explanation of the factors that make up dependent origination, paticcasamuppada. And we saw in this part of the sutta how the chain of conditions that constitute our existence within samsara, the round of birth and death, is traced back to ignorance. Ignorance is the most fundamental condition. And so the entire process of bondage, or the entire process of bondage to the round of rebirth, all ultimately stems from ignorance, which means not understanding things as they truly are, or understanding things in a distorted, unrealistic way. And so, for Buddhism, the key to liberation, the key to release from the round of rebirth, is wisdom. Wisdom is what we call in Pali, panya, or in Sanskrit, prajna. And prajna, or panya, is to be arrived at, or to be achieved, particularly through the practice of insight meditation. Insight meditation is vipassana. Okay, and so one practices vipassana, the insight meditation, in order to acquire panya, wisdom. And wisdom is expressed as the knowledge and vision of things as they really are, understanding things not through the distorting lens of the conceptual mind, but understanding things accurately, directly, in accordance with their true nature. And in the Nikayas, we find that to develop panya, or wisdom, means to understand the phenomena that make up our own experience, and to understand them in accordance with particular, what I call particular patterns. Or we can say that we use certain formulas as templates through which to view our experience in order to understand experience in a way that leads to liberation. Even though the sutras themselves use the expression yatha bhuta jnana darsana, which means knowledge and vision of things as they actually are, it seems to me that what is actually taking place is not an attempt to understand things in a detached, objective way, according to the methodology of, say, modern physical sciences, but rather one is structuring one's investigation according to a particular pragmatic pattern. A pragmatic pattern which is directed to a particular goal or end, and that end is liberation, to liberate. And so one has to view phenomena not from a purely detached point of view, but from particular perspectives that will enable one to overcome clinging and craving, which are the emotional roots of bondage, and to overcome ignorance, which is the cognitive counterpart, the distorted understanding that maintains craving and clinging. And so looking through the Nikayas, particularly the Samyutta Nikaya, what I found is that the text arrange phenomena according to different classes, different sets of categories, which are different ways of viewing our experience. And then with regard to each particular category, with regard to each particular mode of analyzing our experience, the text set up certain templates or patterns of investigation which will generate the desired result, the overcoming of attachment, the achievement of liberation. So I'm going to put a table on the board which shows what I call the intersection of these two modes of analysis. The vertical column is analysis according to the different groups of phenomena, the different ways of analyzing experience. And then those are the rows. The rows will be the different ways of analyzing experience. And then the columns will be the different templates that one applies, or different patterns that one applies to these categories in order to be able to understand them in this pragmatic way, this way directed to liberation. What I've just said might seem a little bit abstract, but now I'm going to fill it out concretely. Seems somewhat complicated, but I will explain what each of these terms means. Okay, so on the far left we have the contents. These are the different factors of experience which the Buddha or the Buddha's text organized into particular groups. And so we have the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases, or actually we should say the 6 or 12 sense bases, because 6 of them are internal, that is the 6 sense faculties, and then the 6 types of objects, the corresponding types of objects. Then there are the elements. Sometimes 6 elements are mentioned, sometimes 18 elements. Then additional to this, sometimes analysis is made in terms of feelings. So just one particular type of factor is selected out, feelings, to treat according to these patterns. And then the last of these subjects is the faculties. The text mentions various groups of faculties: sense faculties, spiritual faculties, but they're treated sometimes according to these same patterns. Okay, what are the patterns themselves? The patterns are what is shown in the top row. And so 4TP means the Four Truth Pattern, the pattern of the Four Noble Truths. So what is the pattern of the Four Noble Truths? First, you present what is the phenomenon one is investigating. What is the particular problem or subject that one is investigating. Then one traces its cause or its origin, then its cessation, how does one bring it to an end, and then last, what is the path or way that brings it to an end. And so the Four Noble Truths apply this pattern simply to the fact of dukkha or suffering. But we saw already in the Sammaditthi Sutta that the Four Truth Pattern could be applied to any of the factors in dependent origination. For example, the Sammaditthi Sutta begins with old age and death. What is the origin of old age and death? Birth. What is the cessation or ending of old age and death? The ending of birth. And what is the way to the ending of birth? The Noble Eightfold Path. And so, in the Sammaditthi Sutta, that pattern is applied to each of the 12 factors in dependent origination. And as we go on, we'll see how this Four Truth Pattern is applied to the Five Aggregates. It's also applied to the six sense bases, the elements, and so on. In fact, yesterday I started to fill in the empty boxes here with the suttas, the sutta references, where each of these subjects or the content is treated through each of these patterns. I thought I would be able to finish it yesterday afternoon, but I didn't succeed. But for our next class, I should have it finished. So then you can look up the suttas yourself and then verify the validity of the method of treatment. Okay, what is called here the next pattern, IDN, or it could have also been called ISN. This is the three characteristics, applying the three characteristics of impermanence. Then what is impermanent is dukkha, or suffering. And then what is impermanent and dukkha, impermanent and bound up with suffering, is anatta, non-self, not self. Okay, so we'll find this pattern applied again to these different groups of phenomena. Okay, the third pattern is I call it the Gratification Triad. And this is the pattern of, the Buddha speaks about three things that he had to understand in order to claim to have reached complete or perfect enlightenment. We already went through this Gratification Triad when we took the chapter called Deepening One's Perspective on the World. We read it on pages 192, 193. So the three terms of this triad are gratification, danger, and escape. In the suttas that come on pages 192, 193, we took these three terms as they apply to the world as a whole. So what is the gratification in the world? What is the danger in the world? What is the escape from the world? But when we look into, and these sutras come from the Anguttara Nikaya, but what we find in the Samyutta Nikaya is that the same set of sutras, or the same methodology, is applied to each of the main terms of analysis used in the Samyutta Nikaya. That is, it's applied to the five aggregates, the six sense bases, the six elements, the types of feelings, the different faculties. Okay, so this is what I call the Gratification Triad, because there's a limited amount of space, but more fully we can call it gratification, danger, and escape. And then the fourth pattern that we find is simply an expansion of the gratification triad. It's expanded to 5 terms by adding the origin and passing away. And so to understand something fully and accurately, one has to understand its origin, its passing away or vanishing, then its gratification, danger, and escape. Okay, and so now the different classifications that make up the contents of this table. This is what I refer to as the domain of wisdom. This is the area in which wisdom has to work, in which wisdom has to investigate. That is, one develops wisdom by investigating, by exploring the 5 aggregates, the 6 sense bases, the 6 or 18 elements, and so on. And when one investigates them in terms of these patterns. And so the next substantial portion of the chapter on the light of wisdom is devoted to bringing together these sutras dealing with the 5 aggregates, the 6 or 12 sense bases, and the 6 elements. And so we begin with the section on the 5 aggregates. This starts on page 335. The 5 aggregates are particularly important since this is the main scheme, the most common scheme that the Buddha uses to analyze the nature of experience. And so we can say that the 5 aggregates constitute first an analysis of a sentient being, a living being. What is the constitution of a living being? When we speak about I, myself, me, what are these terms actually referring to? And when the Buddha investigates this question, what he finds is that all such terms as I, me, myself are referring in actuality to these 5 aggregates, one or another of them, or the collection of them. But apart from these 5 aggregates, according to the Buddha, there is no self standing behind them as their owner, their possessor, their master. And so the five aggregates are first the constitution of a living being. But the Buddha is investigating the living being from the standpoint of actual experience. And so the five aggregates are also the components of experience. Usually our experience occurs to us as, I call it, a concrete block. It seems to be a solid whole. But when we investigate our experience closely and carefully, we can see how it consists of these five layers or five threads, interwoven threads. So that experience is a kind of textile which is composed of these five interwoven threads. The five threads, as we'll see, are physical form, the body and outer sense objects, feelings, perceptions, the volitional formations, and consciousness. Okay, but the Buddha isn't undertaking this investigation of existence or of experience just from an impartial, objective, scientific point of view, but he's taking this investigation from within the framework of his own teaching. And so the Buddha says, in some sutras, he says, what I teach is just dukkha and the ending of dukkha, suffering and the cessation of suffering. And in the Buddha's first sermon, the turning of the wheel of Dharma, he says that after he's explained different aspects of the First Noble Truth, he says, in brief, the five aggregates of clinging are dukkha. And so when we look deeply into the First Noble Truth, we see that the real content of the First Noble Truth is the five aggregates. And the other types of suffering, birth, old age, sickness, death, and so on, these are just concrete examples of suffering that arise out of the experience of the five aggregates. But if one has sharp insight or wisdom, one can move directly into the five aggregates and see how the five aggregates themselves are dukkha, unsatisfactory or bound up with suffering. And so this is why the Buddha gives special attention to the five aggregates. Another reason is because the five aggregates are the particular base where craving and clinging settle and thrive. So when one is clinging to anything, one can ask, what is one clinging to? And of course one could say, I'm clinging to my wealth, I'm clinging to power, I'm clinging to position, I'm clinging to sensual pleasures, I'm clinging to a beautiful car, clinging to a beautiful girlfriend, clinging to a beautiful house, clinging to stocks and bonds. But when one looks closely to see what one is actually clinging to, one sees that underlying these objective sources of clinging, there is the experience that is bringing satisfaction or pleasure. And that experience bringing satisfaction or pleasure is a combination of these five aggregates. And so in order to uproot clinging, one has to investigate the five aggregates to see that ultimately they are not worth clinging to. And so by giving up the clinging to the five aggregates, one achieves release freedom, liberation. And so this is why the Buddha gives special attention to the five aggregates, because when we investigate the five aggregates closely and carefully, we see that when we see them in their true nature, then the clinging that attaches to them is deprived of its resting place. It's deprived of its nest. It has no place left to settle. And when clinging is removed, then the mind is liberated from all of its taints. Okay, so these five aggregates are particular ways of analyzing experience, investigating experience. Okay, let us go directly now into some of the texts that we have here, rather than going through the tables. And as we go through the text, we'll see how the table gets filled out. So let me backtrack on that. I'll just go through on the table in order to get some idea of what is meant by each of the aggregates. I'll go through what is called the characteristic of each of the five aggregates. Okay, the first aggregate is called in Pali rupa, which means it's translated as form. Sometimes it's translated material form, sometimes matter, sometimes materiality. We could say that the aggregate of rupa comprises all of the physical aspects of our experience. The sutta uses a wordplay to explain the meaning of rupa. Okay, sometimes these explanations that come in the suttas involve words of play on words rather than literal derivations. And so, in this text, this is Sutta number 79 of the Kanda Samyutta, the question is raised, why is it called rupa? Why is it called form? And then the answer given is rupati. The verb rupati is not etymologically connected with the word rupa at all. It's a little bit like saying, why is it called wind? Why is it called wind? Because it winds around. Therefore it's called wind. Or why is it called water? Why is it called water? Because it washes away thirst. So we take washes away, start with W-A, and from thirst we take the T, put them together, what? And then we get the word water. So what washes away thirst is called water. Okay, so rupati, which in this translation, in order to try to show the connection, I use the word deformed. So rupati could have been translated attacked, molested, worn away. So it is deformed. What is it deformed by? It is deformed by heat and cold, by sun and wind. I think it goes on to say by insects, flies, snakes, and other creeping things. Okay, so that's a playful explanation. But to understand more closely and literally what is meant by rupa, we can take the idea of physical form or anything with material substance. Okay, then the second aggregate is feeling. The Pali word is vedana, which is translated as feeling. But by vedana is not meant, by feeling is not meant what we call emotions, like love, anger, pride, kindness, sympathy, but rather by feeling is meant in a very narrow and specific sense the particular experience tone or the felt tone of our experience. So it is the tone of experience as being either pleasant, painful, or neutral, neither painful nor pleasant. So in that very specific and narrow sense, that is how we're to understand the meaning of vedana as feeling. Okay, the third aggregate is called sanya. Sanya is what we translate as perception. So some translators have used conception in the sense of conceiving. The word sanya is based on the root nya, which means to know, plus the prefix come, which has a kind of synthetic function, bringing together. So sanya is a composite knowing, but maybe that doesn't really quite convey the true idea. We get the true idea rather from understanding its function, which is the function of sanya is to select the distinguishing aspects, marks, or characteristics of things. So the example given in the sutta, it perceives, what does it perceive? It perceives blue, yellow, red, white. Those are just examples given in the case of visual perception of forms. But one can perceive through any of the senses. Through any of the senses, perception has the function of, let's say, singling out the distinctive marks of the object. So when one meets a person for the first time, even if one isn't doing it deliberately, but when one sees the person's face, the mind naturally will single out particular features of the face, take them all together compositely, and then one uses that as a marker for identifying this person. So maybe you meet somebody at a party or at work. Next week, you're walking down the street, or go into a shop, and then you see this person in the shop. How do you recognize that person? Because on that first occasion when you met that person, you singled out certain features of that person's face, physique, so on. And so now you can recognize on the basis of that act of perception. So perception contributes to recognition and to memory, to remembrance. Okay, the fourth aggregate is called the Aggregate of Empowering Sankharas. Last time we met, I explained the word sankhara in relation to dependent origination. Here it has basically the same meaning. The root is karoti, or kar, which means to make, to create, and then the prefix san means together. So the sankharas are things that create other things, that put other things together. But in relation to the five aggregates, the Buddha uses the word sankhara specifically in relation to acts of volition, to the intentional activity of the mind. Since it is this intentional activity, this volitional activity that creates and puts together the things of the world. And so, if we need a particular utensil or particular vessel for drinking, then through our volitional activity we create cups and glasses. If we want to preserve things that are spoken discourses, music, we create these are recording devices. I was going to say tape recorders, but we don't find them anymore. We create recording devices. So these recording devices are expressions or products of the volition, the intention of having devices to record. If one wants to write, one creates markers and pens and pencils, which are products of the intention, the volition, to have an instrument of writing. So everything that creates other things, so say all of the works of music, literature, art, buildings, architecture, corporations, companies, business enterprises, all the inventions of human ingenuity, these are all products or expressions of the sankharas, the volitional formation. Okay, then the fifth aggregate is the aggregate of consciousness. This is vijnana. Vijnana, like sanya, comes from the root jna, which means to know, but here it has the prefix vi, which gives the sense of distinguishing or distinctly. So vijnana has a sense of distinct knowledge or distinguishing knowledge. The sutta gives as an explanation of consciousness, it says, it should be it cognizes, not they cognize, but it cognizes. What does it cognize? It cognizes sour, bitter, sweet, salty, and other flavors. I have to say this explanation is not very helpful. It's a little bit confusing. Because it gives the impression that the function of perception or sanya is to distinguish colors, and the function of consciousness or vijnana is to distinguish taste. I don't know if this comes from the Buddha. I can't give them a deal with them for clarity of exposition. But couldn't give more than the C+. I don't know how to explain it, to justify this. Okay, I find it more helpful to, instead of taking this explanation, to take the fact that consciousness arises on the basis of the six sense faculties, the six sense organs. So we have eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose, tongue, body, and mental consciousness. So this is my own understanding, that consciousness is the basic awareness that arises through each of these 6 sense faculties, making available to us an objective domain corresponding to that particular type of consciousness. So the I consciousness is the basic awareness arising through the I, opening up to us the whole realm of visible forms. Ear consciousness is the awareness arising based upon the ear faculty, opening up to us the entire realm or domain of sound. And similarly with each of the other 5 physical sense faculties, or 5 types of sensory consciousness, then the 6th type of consciousness, the mind consciousness, as I explained earlier, the mind consciousness can take the objects of all the other senses. Since the mind can range over visible forms, sounds, smells, tastes, and textures, comparing them, distinguishing them. And the mind consciousness also takes its own class of objects, ideas, mental images, judgments, concepts, everything that's not purely of a sensory nature is acceptable to the mind consciousness. Okay, so the way I understand the distinction, consciousness and perception, consciousness opens up the field of awareness. Consciousness is the awareness opening up the field, the particular objective field, and then perception is what ranges over that objective field and distinguishes the characteristics of the objects encountered within that particular domain. Now what has to be understood, and this is a very important point, is that the 5 aggregates always occur together on every occasion of experience. On a particular occasion, one or another of the 5 aggregates might be prominent, more prominent than the others. But always, on every occasion of experience, all 5 of them are present together, inseparably interwoven, constituting the texture of that experience. So to give an example, just one simple example, I'm in my room doing some work, then the telephone rings. Okay, so there is, on that occasion, there is my bodily form, that belongs to the aggregate and rupa of form, especially on this occasion when it's becoming prominent in its function is the ear, the organ of hearing. Then there is the sound, the ringing sound, that also belongs to the aggregate of form. Then, when the telephone starts ringing, here the aggregate of perception will become prominent, because there's a perceiving telephone is ringing. Then there will be some feeling accompanying this. If I'm expecting an important call or some friend who said, I will call you at 8 o'clock, then there might be a pleasant feeling. If I'm not expecting a call and I'm gaze, it's concentrating on some work, and then the telephone rings, there might be a feeling of displeasure, annoyance. This would be a painful feeling. Okay, when the telephone rings, then there comes the volition. Usually it's the volition that motivates one to pick up the telephone, to answer it. So if one doesn't want to be bothered, one might decide, I won't answer the phone, just let it ring. Especially nowadays, they have these advertising over the telephone. In election season, you get political organizations calling, vote for so-and-so, vote for so-and-so. Okay, and so we have some volitional formation present, and then there's the awareness of all of this, that awareness which makes this whole experience of hearing the telephone ring possible. That is the consciousness. In this case, first the ear consciousness, which picks up the sound of the phone, and then the mind consciousness, which distinguishes the sound, identifies the sound. And as I said, the mind consciousness can work through the ear organ to distinguish and identify sound. I had an interesting experience of this just, I think, a little more than a week ago, 2 weeks ago. I was traveling from my father's house in Long Island into New York City on the Long Island Railroad. This might be the first time I took the Long Island Railroad in decades. And so I had the ticket, and with that railroad that goes from my father's house, I have to change trains at Jamaica. And so when the conductor came, he took my ticket, what they call it, punched it, gave it back to me, and said, "You changed it to Jamaica." And then he said some words. It just sounded to me like, "Gip, gip, gip, gip." And then he walked into the next car. And I was going to ask him, I was going to get up and ask him what he said, but then I thought, not important, I'll figure it out when I get to Jamaica. Then the question came to my mind suddenly, what train, where do I get the train that I'm supposed to transfer into? You know, when I change it to Jamaica, what platform will the other train be on? And suddenly, when that question came to my mind, suddenly that sound, jip, 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 crystallized into clear words. The train is on the next platform. The train is directly across on the same platform. That's what he said. So when he first said it, all I heard was jip, 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 jip. But when the question came to my mind, where do I get the other train? Then suddenly those words, they've been picked up by my ear consciousness, but the mind consciousness couldn't figure them out till the question came. Then the mind consciousness translated those sounds into intelligible words. Go across the platform to get the train into Manhattan. Okay, maybe at this point then I'll ask whether there's any questions on what I've presented so far on the Five Aggregates. But if there are questions that are to be clarified by the sutras that we'll study, then I'll postpone answering the question.
On that point, could this whole process be based on mind consciousness alone? Or does there have to be material experience?
No, there can be experiences which occur entirely as experiences of mind consciousness. Of course, within human experience, the mind will function on the basis of the physical body, and so there's always the physical form present. But the process of consciousness doesn't have to be based upon the processing of sensory data, but it's be working with its own internal objects. For example, a mathematician working out a mathematical equation. Of course, to make it more convenient for himself, he might write aspects of the equation on the blackboard, make it visible. But what he's actually dealing with are relations between ideas and concepts. So it's a purely mental operation.
So we think that training is internal.
Of course, yes, of course. Did you had a question?
I did, but I think I have the answer in the phone ringing.
Oh, Richard?
This is more thinking about perception and empathy. When you said talk about the phone ringing, you mentioned identifying the telephone ringing as part of perception.
Yeah.
I guess the identification with it being a telephone, isn't that a consciousness, or is perception more the tones and that you hear rather than the identification of an object, or the meaning of an object?
Yeah, okay, this is a good question. What is actually taking place with these stages of, let's say, use the general word cognition, stages of cognition. Okay, the way I would understand it, consciousness is what is making this whole field of sounds available. Now, perception at a more rudimentary stage is just bringing in the sound. And so initially, there is, in fact, at the stage of ear consciousness, what perception is doing is just bringing in the sound. But then when we come to the stage of mind consciousness, then it's perception that's arisen together with the mind consciousness that would be identifying that sound as a telephone. That's the way I would understand it. Yeah, but they work together so closely that sometimes it's difficult to clearly distinguish their functions. Okay, take the microphone.
I'm sorry, but you clarified that with your story about training.
Yeah.
That it's the mind consciousness.
Yeah.
It's writing it down, but there's nothing of it until the later stage.
Yeah. And then this was also, again, this would be perception working here. It's the perception, the first occasion would be the perception arisen with the ear consciousness. So for that perception, when it tried to distinguish what was the sound, all it heard was something like a mumbling. But then the perception arisen with somehow the ear consciousness actually got his words, but the mind wasn't sharp enough to distinguish them. But then on the occasion when the question came to my mind, where do I get the other train? Then this was an occasion of mind consciousness because he wasn't speaking at the time. So it was the retention of the sound, but it was the mind consciousness that was operating upon that sound and the function of perception, or the factor of perception, that could make out the meaning of the words. That's the way I would understand the distinction.
Please, something clear that you said earlier. With the elimination of cravings, then there's no longer a nest for cravings.
There's no what?
Nest.
Nest, yeah.
Is that a sentence?
Something like that, right, yeah. No resting place or nest.
It was craving.
Yeah. Craving and clinging.
You may have said this before, because I can hear one way, but what or who is training and why?
Well, you see, maybe that question will be answered as we go through the text. But let me just be brief that according to the Buddha's teaching, there is no real who that is clinging, but the who is the idea of an I or a self that arises as an illusion or delusion based upon the interdependent functioning of the five aggregates.
Why does this I want to cling on to this experience?
That arises basically because of ignorance. Yeah. You see, you come in late. We start the class at 9:30, and I explained that at the very beginning of the class.
Between the Sankara related to the five aggregates and also dependent on
Right. Actually, they're both. The meaning of both is volitional formation, but the way I would understand it, in dependent origination, the five aggregates, one is taking the volitional formations in a very comprehensive sense. All the volitions involved in any kind of activity, no matter what it might be, in the case, and then this is a point. You see, in the suttas, when the definition is given of what is meant by Sankhara Khanda, the answer given is simply the 6 types of intention, the 6 groups of intention. We'll come to those in a little while. But in the Abhidharma, which is a later development of Buddhist thought, the Sankhara Khanda is used somewhat like an umbrella category to include all of the other mental factors mentioned in the suttas that don't come into the other aggregates. So all the factors like greed, hatred, delusion, also the good factors, generosity, loving kindness, wisdom, many other mental functions are just all grouped into the Sankhara Khanda. Now, in dependent origination, the factor of Sankhara is restricted to volitions of body, speech, and mind, which are the volitional activities considered from the standpoint of creating karma. So there's the intentions or volitions considered in their capacity to create karma, which will sustain the movement, the forward movement of the cycle of birth and death. So the two are not really completely different. There's some overlap, but they're being looked at from different points of view, with different purposes in mind. Does somebody else have a question? Okay, some written questions. Okay, the first question is volition, a subset of Sankhara in the five aggregates. This I just answered. In the sutta way of explanation, the Sankhara Khanda, the aggregate of Sankharas, is simply defined as the 6 types of volition. But in the Abhidharma method, the volitions become a subset of the Sankharas. And can we think of the first 4 aggregates as the active doer and the 5th consciousness as the passive knower? I would tend to say that the active doer would be the aggregate of volitional formation, and feeling, perception, consciousness work together in knowing. But even when doing is taking place, when doing is occurring, there's also feeling, perception, and consciousness. So perhaps doing and knowing shouldn't be completely distinguished from one another. Okay, third, since all 5 aggregates occur together, this would imply that there is no such thing as an out-of-body experience. Let us say that there is such a thing, or at least from all the evidence, there are such things as out-of-body experiences, but out-of-body is a a bit of a misnomer for that type of experience, since the experience is taking place while the person is still existing with the physical body, but somehow what happens is that the consciousness of the person is able to function at a distance from the normal physical body, and the consciousness is even able to view one's own body as an object to itself, so that when some people have the experience, an out-of-body experience, as if their consciousness might be up on the ceiling, looking down at themselves, sitting at floor level, having that experience. And so if the body were to be destroyed, the out-of-body experience would also come to an end. Or even if one were to shake the person, they would arise from that out-of-body experience, because the experience is still based on the body. Okay, I think we should move on now into the text. And so now we come to page 335, and this will be a sutta which is going to give some analysis and explanation of the five aggregates in terms of their nature, and it's going to apply to them what I call the Four Truth Pattern, to use the pattern of the Four Noble Truths as a perspective or a template for looking at and understanding the five aggregates. Okay, so the Buddha begins by saying there are these five aggregates subject to clinging. So the five aggregates are the objects of clinging. So what are the five? The form aggregate, subject to clinging, feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. Okay, then the Buddha next makes a very momentous statement. He says, so long as I did not directly know as they really are, the five aggregates subject to clinging in four phases, or we might say from 4 points of view. I did not claim that I had awakened to the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment in this world with its Devas, Mara, and Brahma, in this population with its ascetics and Brahmins, its Devas and human beings. But when I directly knew all of this, that is the five aggregates in terms of the 4 phases, then I claimed to have awakened to the unsurpassed perfect enlightenment. So this is the opening statement. Now the Buddha is going to explain what he means by these 4 phases. So what are these 4 phases? I directly knew form, its origin, its cessation, and the way leading to its cessation. I directly knew feeling, perception, volitional formations, consciousness, its origin, its cessation, and the way leading to its cessation. Okay, so this establishes the basic framework in terms of the 4 Noble Truths. And now the Buddha moves into each particular aspect. So first, what, monks, is form? The 4 great elements, the 4 primary elements, and the form derived from the 4 great elements. This is called form. Okay, so what are the 4 great elements? We have the earth element, the liquid or water element, the fire element, and the air or wind element. Those are the 4 primary elements. And then based upon these 4 primary elements, there are different types of secondary forms which are derived from them. This would include the form of the sense faculties, the eye, ear, nose, tongue, the sensitive parts of the body, the form of the sense objects, visible forms, sounds, odors, tastes. So in the Abhidharma they say that the tactile object is the four elements themselves. Or actually, technically, they say it's three of the elements. I disagree with that. But it's a rather technical issue, don't have to go into it, you know. Okay, and it seems to me also just taking even some muscles, tissues, bones, all of these are types of matter which are derived from the four great elements. Okay, then what is the condition for the arising of forms? And here it seems that the text is explaining this specifically in relation, or that the text is answering this question specifically in relation to organic matter, the matter of the living body. So the cause or for the arising of form is nutriment. I would actually have to say that this statement has to be supplemented or maybe elaborated with some other explanation. I would say that the cause for the arising of physical form in the sense of a particular body would be the impregnation of an egg in the act of sexual intercourse, and then the maturation of the embryo and the fetus through the stages of embryonic development up to the stage of physical birth. That is the actual coming into being of the form constituting a living body. But from the very moment that the embryo becomes lodged in the mother's womb and starts to develop, what is necessary for its maintenance is nutriment. And so through the whole course of our life, what sustains our bodily form is nutriment. And so we could say that the act of nutrition is actually the process by which we take particular types of physical form from the outer world, external form that contains some nutritive essence or some nutritive substance to it, and then we assimilate that external material form. We assimilate it to our own body. Our own body, through the process of metabolism, extracts from the form we have ingested. It takes out from that ingested form, the food, what we call food. It takes out the nutrients needed to sustain life. It takes out the sugars, breaks the starch down into sugars, takes the protein out, breaks it down into amino acids, takes out the minerals and vitamins, and then through the process of metabolism reassembles those nutrients in ways that will sustain the physical body. How does one express this biologically? It metabolizes them into... Any doctors in the room? Okay, except to say it metabolizes them. So it metabolizes them, it constitutes them into the physical substance of the body. Okay, so with the arising of nutriment, there's the arising of form. With the cessation of nutrient, there is the cessation of form. So if one goes on a long fast, then the form of the body starts to diminish. One becomes thinner. And if one continues this fast the body, or if one is subjected to starvation, to a famine, if one is living during the time of a famine, so that one doesn't have enough food or even any food at all, the body becomes thinner and thinner, weaker and weaker, till it becomes subject to different illnesses, and then if that famishing of the body is continued long enough, then death takes place, and the body ceases to exist as a living body. Okay, then this Noble Eightfold Path is the way leading to the cessation of form. Or to misunderstand this, to think when one practices the Noble Eightfold Path, one has to go on long fasts, so one is not taking in any food, and that way the form of the body starts to diminish until one eventually dies of starvation. And that's the cessation of form. So I think that's a misunderstanding. This statement, well, that would be a misunderstanding. I think the statement, the Noble Eightfold Path is the way to the cessation of form, this has to be understood through explanation. It's through developing the Noble Eightfold Path that one develops wisdom. Through wisdom, one uproots craving and clinging, and through uprooting craving and clinging, one stops the process of rebirth, so there's no coming into being of bodily form in a future existence. So this is the way I would understand how the Noble Eightfold Path is the way leading to the cessation of form. Okay, so this is the way the Four Noble Truths are applied to the aggregate of form. Then the Buddha goes on to make a distinction. He says, whatever ascetics and Brahmins, having thus directly known form, its origin and cessation, and the way leading to its cessation, of practicing for the purpose of disenchantment with form, for its fading away and cessation, they are practicing well, or practicing rightly. Those who are practicing well have gained a foothold in this Dhamma and discipline. What the text is referring to here are those, when it speaks about those ascetics and Brahmins, it's actually speaking about any person who has directly known the aggregate of form through these four angles, from these four angles. And one who has known the aggregate of form from these four angles is one who has directly penetrated the Four Noble Truths. And this is what makes a person a noble disciple at the stage of a trainee. It is one who has entered the irreversible Eightfold Path, leading directly and infallibly to full liberation, to full deliverance. This would then be the disciple in terms of the four stages of enlightenment. This would be a disciple at one of the three lower stages, the stage of stream enterer, once returner, or non-returner. Because it's with the achievement of stream entry that one gets this global vision of the five aggregates in terms of their nature, their arising, their ceasing, and the way to their ceasing. And once one gets that global vision, then one continues to practice, one builds upon that insight, one builds upon that vision, and building upon that vision leads to disenchantment or disillusionment, then to the fading away of clinging, and then ultimately to the cessation or ending of the five aggregates. And so those are the disciples in the stage of training to gain final liberation. But then the text continues and says, whatever ascetics and Brahmins, having thus directly known form, its origin, its cessation, and the way leading to its cessation. Okay, so they've gotten this global vision, this direct knowledge of the aggregate of form, in fact, all five aggregates. Then, through disenchantment with form, through its fading away and cessation, they are liberated by non-clinging. That is, they've developed that vision to the point that clinging has come to an end. And so the Buddha says, they are well liberated. And those who are well liberated are consummate ones. Here the text uses a word which was a word that was very highly pregnant with meaning during the time when the Buddha lived. There was a word used by many different spiritual communities to designate the person who reached full enlightenment and liberation. The word is tavily. And so we translate it into English, we use a word like consummate one, but the English word maybe causes more puzzlement than clarity. But within the Indian context, when you have the word tavily, one knows that it means a person who has reached the peak, the high point of spiritual development, one who has cut off all of the bonds and fetters and who has gained the absolute liberation. Well, it's a different word, but the word tavali will suggest a person who has gained moksha. But the word moksha, as the Sanskrit word, is related to the word here, well liberated. The word well liberated the word well liberated is su the mutta. Su is just a prefix which means well or fully. Then the again is a prefix which just gives a little more emphasis. But the key word is the participle here, mutta. Okay, so the participle mutta, or the Sanskrit form is mukta. They come from the root munch, which means to free, to be free. And from this one gets the noun mukti. With Sanskrit it would be mukti. And in Pali another noun, moksha, which in Sanskrit would be moksha. And so those are all the words which mean liberated or liberation. And then one who has achieved this liberation is called tavali. Okay, so those who are well liberated are the consummate ones. Tavalino. And as to those consummate ones, there is no round for their manifestation. In other words, they no longer come back to the round of birth and death, the round of becoming. Okay, so this is the explanation now with regard to the aggregate of forms. We'll continue through all of the five aggregates. So now the next one is what is feeling. Then we have, this is the usual way in the sutras. When a question is raised, what is this, what is that? One doesn't get a conceptual explanation the way we'd expect from a college textbook. Clear explanation that will relate the concept being defined in terms of other concepts. What we get basically is an enumeration of the subgroups that come under that general concept. So what is feeling? There are 6 classes of feeling. Feeling born of eye contact, feeling born of ear contact, feeling born of nose contact, feeling born of tongue contact, feeling born of body contact, feeling born of mind contact. This is called feeling. So this doesn't really make it very clear exactly what is meant by feeling, but the other explanation given in Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, sutta number 79, works somewhat better. What one feels is pleasure, pain, or neither pain nor pleasure. So feeling is that quality of experience that, let's say, feeling is that mental function which experiences its object in a way that can be either pleasant, painful, or neither painful nor pleasant. Or feeling is that mental function that experiences in a particular affective way, not effective, but affective with an A, A-F-F-E-C-T-I-V-E. But then feeling, according to this sutta, can arise through any of the 6 sense bases, through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. And feeling is born or arises through a particular type of contact, the contact that occurs through that sense faculty. And so, when the question is raised, what is the arising of feeling? What is its origin? What is the answer? Contact. Because feeling is born of such and such a contact. And so contact is the coming together of the sense faculty. Let me say, contact is the coming together of consciousness with its object through the sense faculty. And so the sense faculty is that which serves as the basis for the contact. And so if contact is made through the eye, then there's a feeling born of eye contact. If the feeling occurs, if the contact is made through the body with the sense of touch, then the feeling is feeling born of body contact. If one is thinking of something internally, not attending to the senses, a particular idea, memory, reflection, fantasy, hope, desire arises in the mind, then the feeling that arises through that purely mental contact is the feeling born of mind contact. So feeling arises through the contact, it ceases with the cessation, the feeling ceases with the cessation of contact, and then the Noble Eightfold Path is the way leading to the cessation of feeling. And actually the Noble Eightfold Path, again, this requires some explanation. The Noble Eightfold Path, when one develops it, it doesn't mean that one breaks off all contact with objects in this life, right now. But by developing the Noble Eightfold Path, one brings to an end the cycle of rebirth, and so there's no future contact. There's no contact in any future life to cause new feelings. Okay, then the same statement is made about the ascetics and Brahmins, in this case, who have directly known feeling as origin, cessation, and the way to its cessation. Again, they're distinguished to 2 categories: those in training and those who are consummate ones. The consummate ones are the arahats, who are fully liberated, for whom there's no more manifestation of the round of existence. Okay, then we come to the third aggregate. This is the aggregate of perception. So what is perception? Again, no conceptual answer is given, but rather perception is explained simply by enumerating the 6 types of perception. Perception of forms, sounds, odors, tastes, tactile objects, and mental phenomena. Okay, so that is called perception. But from this explanation, we get some idea of the particular function of perception. Perception is what tunes into the object and distinguishes the object by way of its distinctive qualities. Okay, so this is perception. What is the origin or cause of perception? Perception also is based on contact. With the arising of contact, there is the arising of perception. With the cessation of contact, there is the cessation of perception. And the Noble Eightfold Path is the way to the cessation of perception. Okay, then we'll come to the fourth aggregate. What are the volitional formations, the sankharas? Okay, there are these, again, but this is an interesting point. The question is raised, what are the volitional formations? What are the sankharas? And then the answer is given, there are these 6 classes of volition. Here, different words are used for the general name of the aggregate and for the content. Okay, so the word that's used for volitional formations is sankhara, but then the answer is given that there are these 6 classes or 6 types of volition, and for volition the word used is chaitana. So it doesn't say there are these 6 classes of sankharas, but rather 6 classes of chaitana, volition. And this, I think, is what suggests that the volitional, that sankhara as volitional formation could have a somewhat wider range than chaitana. That, I think, is why the later Buddhist philosophers put all of the other mental factors mentioned in the text in the sankhara kanda. But for the suttas, the most important is chaitana, volition. And so there's volition regarding forms, volition regarding sounds, regarding odors, tastes, tactile objects, and volition regarding mental phenomena. So those are the volitional formations. And so when we experience any sensory object or when we experience any sensory object or any mental object, then we form some volition in regard to it. And that volition belongs to the aggregate of volitional formations. Then what is the origin or the arising of volitional formations? Again, the answer is contact. And so with the arising of contact, there is the arising of volitional formations. With the cessation of contact, there is cessation of volitional formations. And this Noble Eightfold Path is the way to the cessation of volitional formations. And so we should note here 3 of the aggregates the aggregate of feeling, the aggregate of perception, the aggregate of volitional formations originates from contact. So it seems that the aggregate of form as the body is something already present, something given. The aggregate of consciousness is something already present, already given. So it's consciousness operating through the body makes contact with one or another of the 6 types of objects, and then through that contact there arises feeling, perception, and volition. So those 3 aggregates are dependent on contact. And to see the contrast, we'll just move on to the aggregate of consciousness. And what, monks, is consciousness? Give me a clear definition, please. There are these 6 classes of consciousness. A little disappointing, but we can work to figure out the meaning. Eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mind consciousness. This is called consciousness. So consciousness here, this maybe is the clarifying point, is distinguished on the basis of its sense faculty, the sense organ through which it arises. So consciousness arises on the basis of the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, or mind. So that is consciousness. That's why I understand it to mean the awareness that arises, opening up the awareness that arises based on the particular sense faculty, opening up that whole objective domain to the rest of the mental functioning. Okay, with the arising of name and form, there is the arising of consciousness. With the cessation of name and form, there is the cessation of consciousness. Okay, what is meant by name? What is meant by name and form? First there's form, which is the same as the form aggregate. Then there is name. Name, we saw a couple of weeks ago, means the mental functions that arise together with consciousness. These are the mental functions of feeling, perception, volition, contact, and attention. So consciousness arises together with the arising of name and form. And this seems a little paradoxical, because I said just before that consciousness contacts its object through the sense faculty, and when that contact takes place, then there arises feeling, perception, and volition. So this seems to give the impression that consciousness exists at some point without feeling, perception, and volition, and consciousness subsequently makes contact with an object. But actually, for consciousness to arise, it has to be associated with feeling, perception, and volition. And consciousness also requires contact to arise. But it seems that consciousness takes a wider range of supports than feeling, perception, and volition. I don't know if that's clear. If it's not clear, shake your head this way. Not clear. Okay, let us maybe put it this way. Consciousness and name and form exist in a relationship of mutual support, mutual conditioning. So for the constituents of name, that is, feeling, perception, volition, to occur, there has to be consciousness. Without consciousness making contact with an object, there cannot be feeling, perception, volition. Is that clear? Okay. In order for consciousness to occur, there has to be some associated feeling, perception, and volition. One can never have a bare consciousness without feeling, perception, and volition. Is that clear? Okay, so even though we speak about consciousness making contact with an object, and then from that contact there arise feeling, perception, and volition, or we shouldn't think contact exists first, consciousness exists first on its own without feeling, perception, and volition, then afterwards it makes contact, and then feeling, perception, volition arise. Or rather, consciousness is always occurring together with feeling, perception, and volition. But as it's occurring together with feeling, perception, volition, the consciousness makes a new contact. From that new contact, there will arise a new feeling, a new perception, a new volition. Then all of these arise together, momentarily pass away, then consciousness makes a new still a new contact. Then from that new contact there arise feeling, perception, volition. Then these pass away, and there arise consciousness makes a new contact with a new object, maybe based on another sense faculty. Then there arise again feeling, perception, volition, and so on. One after another after another. Does that make it clear? Okay, good. So with the arising of name and form, the arising of consciousness, with the cessation of name and form, the cessation of that act of consciousness, and the Noble Eightfold Path is the way leading to the cessation of consciousness. Right view to right concentration. Then the same statement is made about the ascetics and Brahmins, distinguished as to whether they are trainees or liberated ones, arahats. Okay, maybe I'll stop here and then ask whether there's any questions on anything presented. Let me just get my... Okay, first question.
Hello, I have a question regarding what occurred as somewhat being unclear in the translation as to what the Buddha was saying.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether that could be due to a combination effect.
Being due to what?
Due to a combination of factors.
Okay, yeah.
Such as these words were not written down at the time they were spoken.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot lost.
Yeah, this is actually, yeah.
In the fact that there wasn't a sense of far later, I don't know how many years it was later, after the Buddha's death. And of course, translation issues themselves from Pali to English.
Yeah.
And then the other thing I was wondering is if in fact the Buddha was deliberately unclear, so as to provoke consciousness, to provoke people actually thinking through these things and experiencing them in their own way.
Mm-hmm.
So that sounds more like a statement than a question,
Yeah.
but it's actually a question.
There are actually two very good suggestions. So they seem to be competitive or alternatives. And I can't give a definite answer one way or another. Let me just clear my throat. But it struck me it often struck me as a very real possibility that when the Buddha gave his discourses, he gave a lot more explanation than has been preserved in the text. But during that period, the text had to be preserved and transmitted orally, since writing was not used as a medium for recording spiritual texts. Perhaps during Buddha's time it might not have been used at all. And so it's possible that the Buddha himself gave fuller explanations of what's meant by these terms, and simply to make the text preservable and transmittable, they were just reduced to these kind of schematic or to the form of these schemes, simple schemes. So that's one possible explanation. And then the other one, which is also possible, that the Buddha, I don't think he would have tried to be vague in any way, but it's possible that in the Buddha's time, the meaning of these terms could have been understood simply through common usage, because the Buddha would have been speaking in Indian languages, which would have been part of the common type of discourse used during that period. And so just as people today might speak about perception, consciousness, unless we're in an academic setting, people don't ask me to define precisely what you mean. Well, at least some people won't. Some things but these could have been like common terms of discourse, and so the Buddhist listeners would have understood. But then when we come from a different culture with a different language, then we ask the question, what exactly is meant by these words?
So actually you provided a third explanation. Because the second one, maybe it was deliberate. And so the third explanation is it might have just been the language was understood.
Yeah. I think that's more likely. I don't think the Buddha would have used terms that would have been vague and unclear with the idea of provoking people to think about them. Because there's still plenty to think about in his teaching. But he would have wanted to communicate quite clearly. In fact, it says about the Buddha's teaching, it's sattam sabhyanjana, which means it's possessed of good meaning and possessed of good expression, good formulation.
This question relates to the term enchantment and disenchantment. It seems to go back to the question I asked you before about the eye that is clinging.
Yeah.
Is there more of a description of this eye that's clinging in terms of its other desires? Is that an appropriate word?
In terms of its what?
Desire. Because it seems like there's going to be enchanted, it must be wanting something from this experience.
Yeah, we could explore that issue, but I want to really deal with questions that involve clarification of the meaning of the five aggregates. That would be like a whole different, almost a different subject.
What is the subject of that would be up?
Excuse me?
What is that subject called if I want to try to follow up?
I think anyway we'll probably touch on that subject more directly next week. So if you come next week, then you'll get the clear answer.
My question could have been answered 5 weeks ago and might be answered 3 weeks from now. I'm not sure. Very basically, with all the attributes and elements and aggregates, we have the form of the body, we have the contact of the body. Is there any way for clinging and craving to be neutralized versus totally eliminated and still enjoy the contact, right? Whether appreciate the things the body can appreciate. Everything has to be peace, cessation,
Yeah.
Is there a way to still be in a body but not have desire and clinging?
Yeah. It's certainly possible to be in the body without having desire and clinging, but from the perspective of the early text, that would be just the existence in the body of somebody who's completely eradicated clinging, the residue of existence that continues up to the passing away of that person, a liberated person. But from the perspective of the early text, the aim is to bring to an end the continuous existence of the five aggregates. And so the idea would not be that one continues in embodied form from life to life, free of clinging, in order to enjoy or appreciate the things that embodied existence makes possible. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I guess the question was,
Wait, take the microphone.
Are we basically supposed to give up everything that we have contact with so that we do not appreciate anything beautiful like the sunset?
Oh no, I don't understand in that way at all.
That's just my purpose. We're supposed to treat everything, we're not supposed to treat appreciating, but is there a way to treat appreciating, cease desiring and cease craving, but still appreciate?
I would say definitely so. I would say that the cessation of craving or clinging doesn't mean the ending of the capacity for aesthetic appreciation and enjoyment. This is my point of view, but it also seems to be borne out by texts which are, say, from the early monks and nuns, which express appreciation for the beauties of nature.
Because I just don't know, it's 50 pages and it's like really not clear.
There's a question. Okay, Suki, then Paul.
Going back to the Five Aggregates, how would you explain the process of inspiration or a certain inspiration seemingly coming out of nowhere without conscious understanding? How does it happen? How would you explain those kinds of?
Inspiration occurs, but when one looks into the experience, when we see that the experience itself is constituted of the five aggregates, but it's an experience of inspiration in terms of the five it's an experience of inspiration, but what is undergoing the experience when we say the five aggregates? So I don't see a problem there.
You need the object to have something occur, right?
In a general sense, yeah. It doesn't, but go on.
So what's the object? Sometimes people say it just comes.
Of course, because the mind consciousness is extremely rich. It has extremely vast reserves, both of past experience and potential for new experience. And these work together in various ways to open up, say, the windows or doors for flashes of inspiration, intuition, insight to occur.
So we should say that this is like a kind of a memory.
It's not only a memory. Of course, to have past experiences is a precondition for any inspiration. But the inspiration, if it was just a memory, then it would just be a repetition of what's already been experienced. But let's say the background of our experience conditions the mind in certain ways that open up what I call windows for flashes of intuition, inspiration, insight, creative urges, impulses to occur. And so there's no incompatibility between the scheme of the five aggregate analysis and these experiences of inspiration and intuition. It's just that when we investigate the experience, one can see that the experience can be understood through this lens of the five aggregates. But another thing that I'll add to this, it goes back to what I said in the very beginning of the class. I don't think we should understand that the Buddhism or the Buddha is saying that experience is somehow a compound of taking five different factors, putting them together, and then what you have is a composite entity, as though you could have feelings, perceptions, volitions existing on their own, like chemicals in a chemistry set, and then you mix them together and then you get the compound, the sentient being. But what I say, what is primary is the experience of the sentient being, which is always occurring as a unified whole. But what the Buddha does is to as a pragmatic way to overcome clinging and ignorance, one dissects the experience, or one looks at the experience from these different angles, because these angles represent different strongholds in which clinging becomes lodged, in which clinging becomes established. And so there can be the clinging to the experiences of feeling, especially clinging to experiences of pleasant feeling. So that's where one way in which clinging becomes established. Then there becomes the domain of perception. One clings to things which are considered nice, beautiful, satisfactory, and so one clings there. One clings to one's projects, one's undertaking, one's enterprises, one's ways of molding and shaping the world. That becomes an expression of clinging. And so the Buddha focuses upon these different aspects of experience in order to show where clinging has to be uprooted. But it doesn't mean that experience is just like 5 different stripes brought together as though those stripes could exist independently. Okay, Barbara, did you have your question?
Very quick question.
Okay.
3 feelings, positive, negative, and neutral.
Yeah.
What's the difference between neutral feeling and the sensation feeling? To me, neutral is...
No, neutral is a feeling. When one is not feeling something which is especially pleasant, not especially painful. Let us just take an example. One is just walking down the street, one is not looking up at anything which is particularly enjoyable so that it gives rise to a pleasant feeling. One is not feeling any pain or discomfort in the body. So it's just sort of drifting down the street in we call it neutral mode. So what one is feeling there would be neither pleasant nor painful. Okay, I think we're going to have to stop now. We can go for lunch, and if anybody wants to continue the discussion, then come back at 12 o'clock and we'll have about a half an hour discussion. Okay, so let us end with the sharing of the merits. Okay, so we share the merits of the deities, the nagas, the bhutas, the pure spirits, wishing them to be well and happy, to protect the Buddha's teachings, to protect ourselves and others, to protect the world. Akasata Bhumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyanta Nanumoditva Tiran Rakantu Sasanam Akasata Bhumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantam Nanumoditva Siran Rakantu Desanam Akasata Bhumata Deva Naga Mahidika Punyantam Nanumoditva Siran Rakantu Manparam. Next one in quickly, shortly. Etavatam Hehi Sampadam Punya Sampadam Sabe Devanumodantu Sabe Bhutanumodantu Sabe Satanumodantu Sabha Sampati Siddhya Pavadupadaya Vici Hetato Hetantare Satakayupapanna Rupya Rupicha Asanya Sanino Tu Katamuchantu Pusantu Nibutin